So the Oregon Archaeological Society recognizes that the land known today as Northwestern Oregon and Southwestern Washington is also the traditional homelands of numerous displaced Native populations. These include tribes, bands, villages of Native people who have resided here for thousands of years, including the Chinook Nation, Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of the Siletz, Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, as well as the Yakima Nation. These peoples have rich and varied cultures and continue to this day. Indigenous groups are actively involved in caring for and managing the region's land, water, and people. These groups also support programs, museums, and interpretive centers that promote the rich cultural heritage of the region, and we actively encourage OAS members to seek out present-day Indigenous perspectives. I would also like to say that even though OAS is not a land-based organization necessarily, we do not own any pieces of land, but we as an organization have impacted these cultures directly through our early archaeological work. And today we try to move forward and be co-stewards, and we try to repatriate items back to them actively. So on that note, I'd like to turn it over to Pat.
Okay, thanks, Paula, and thanks for having me here. My name is Pat Lubinski. I'm a professor at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, Washington, right in the middle of Washington State. And we're going to talk a little bit today about a mammoth dig I did, and to some extent there's guests of honor here today also, because this project happened because the landowners were interested in having it happen, and nothing would have happened if it wasn't for the interest of the landowners. And Doug and Bron Mayo are here also in the talk, and they're listed as Charles Douglas Mayo there on the labeling. They just waved for us. And the painting you can see over Bron's head will be in a slide here shortly. So anyway, that little connection with what they've got hanging up in there. Is that at your house or in the cabin? Anyway, so we'll mention them a little bit with some acknowledgements here in a few minutes. So I'm going to do this with talking to you, but also having some images. And I also got a little piece of a video, and we did a little testing before most of you got here, and it should all work out fine. But if it doesn't, stop me if something's not working right, so we can make sure you can hear it and things like that. So first of all, I'm gonna show a little clip from a video. And so it's a little harder to do these audience participation bits when we're on Zoom like this. Did anybody see the actual Hollywood movie 10,000 BC?
No.
Most of you are no, huh? Well, if any of you had seen it, I would ask you what you thought about the factual content of that movie. And people will usually say things like, not so good. Because it had things in it like, say, mammoths building the pyramids. It's Hollywood, right? So they don't always, have things quite, they're not necessarily interested in factual content. They're interested in, entertainment value, right? So when that movie was going to be released, the History Channel knew it was going to be released, and they thought, well, let's make a documentary with a similar title that comes out at about the same time, so that we can kind of piggyback on the Hollywood movie and have some sort of free promotion for our documentary, which we're going to call Journey to 10,000 BC. And maybe because that movie had mammoths building the pyramids in it, they thought they should have some mammoths in their Journey to 10,000 BC. And there's not a lot of mammoth excavations that are going on in the United States, and they heard about us. And so a documentary film crew came out to the project that we've been doing for a few years. At that point, we ended up doing it 6 years altogether for the dig part. And they came out with a boom camera and all that kind of stuff and filmed us. So we're near the beginning of this History Channel thing. So I'm just going to start it at the beginning, and then we'll roll for a 3, 4, 5 minutes, and then it'll hit our part. And then after it kind of does our part, I'm just going to viciously cut it off right after the end of our bit, so we can sort of go back to talking about us instead of what the video wants to do. So this video is something that's, it's a mixed blessing. So it starts off mostly like what most scientists would accept about the past, about 10,000 BC or so in the Americas. But the documentary filmmaker, to some extent, I should have predicted this because of how he talked to me. So he said things like, drama makes good television, okay? Conflict makes good drama. Like, oh, great, for a documentary? And so he would ask me to say things, like he would say, can you say this? And it would be something controversial. He wanted people on the screen saying controversial things that then he could follow up on. And I didn't want to be that guy who said the controversial things and got in trouble. So I would say no. And he'd say, well, can you say this? And I'd say no. He said, well, can you say what you said before with more enthusiasm? Like, yes, I can do that. So that's kind of how it went throughout the filming process. But because he liked drama and he liked conflict, he really liked the idea that people came to the Americas across the frozen North Atlantic. And so he ended up then with a little problem where in his mind he had Europeans here, but then he has to have Native Americans here too. So he hired an actor to play a European and another actor to play a Native American so they could have a hand-to-hand combat for control of North America. So this video gets really weird later on, and most scientists would have a hard time with it. And I'm sure some tribal members would think it's really kind of awful when it gets to some later parts. But it starts off pretty much how a lot of people would think is acceptable. So we're going to start off with that part, and then we'll talk about it more later. So it's the History Channel, so it might have a little drama here and there. That's an attempt at humor, so you should laugh because that's as good as it's going to get. Anyway, here we go. So first of all, some acknowledgements. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is on private property, and Doug and Bron Mayo are the landowners. And because it's, when we started off, there were mammoth bones and there wasn't any obvious archaeology yet. So at that point, there's really not a lot of rules about what happens with paleontology remains. So if the Mayos had wanted to, they could have dug them up and sold them on eBay totally legally. But they didn't want to do that. They were very interested. I'm putting words in their mouth and they're sitting right here. But anyway, they were very interested. So they asked us to get involved, and they said, can you come out and look at this? And then maybe can you do more than that? And then can you make this open to the public so people can come visit? And they were huge drivers behind anything that we did out at the project at all. So hugely important. We also had people donate money and time and equipment and stuff like that. But the main way that we got this 6 years worth of field work done is that students were paying to learn excavation methods by taking it as an archaeological field school. So that was the main way. We'll talk about that in a second. On the left-hand side there, I have the first painting that Bron did out of a whole series of paintings she did that related to what might have been happening on their property thousands of years ago. And so this was when maybe we thought maybe we could find a baby as well as an adult mammoth. And then a whole series of more. You can see behind, if you're looking at the images, you probably can't see it now because we're in share screen, but behind Bron, she has one of them, another painting. And I've got another one actually hanging on the wall right there of the dig itself. Anyway, and maybe we'll give them a chance to say something at the end part, Doug and Bron. Okay, so first of all, as you could see in that History Channel bit, there was that first initial bone that was found. It was found during construction of a road. Basically, Heather's house was on the side of a hill, and in order to safely get to the house, the county said you need to make a big long road along the side of this hill. And so they built this big road, and they were pretty much done with it. And the backhoe operator stopped for lunch one day and walked around and saw some really big bones sticking out of chunks of frozen February dirt. And being a deer hunter, realized that those were not deer bones and got pretty interested in that's sort of the beginning of things happening. And then those bones ended up in my lab. I'm I'm an archaeologist, not a paleontologist, so already we're potentially confused here. You and an archaeological society know what the difference is, but as you know, many people in the general public don't know that so well. So I suppose I've only made that worse by being an archaeologist that was involved with a paleontology project for several years. We'll get here in a few minutes though to where it's both paleontology and archaeology. But in any event, my specialty within archaeology is zooarchaeology. I look at animal bones from archaeological sites. Just like Dr. Virginia Butler here, her real specialty is fish bones. I do other things too. I don't usually do anything this big. This is the only project I've done where I had mammoths to deal with. So I don't have a lot of comparative mammoth skeletons in my lab. Kind of hard to find. So anyway, this first bone that was brought back, we knew it was of a size that it basically had to be something in the elephant group. And based on the shape, I drew some lines on here. I knew it wasn't a mastodon because the shape of that particular part of the bone, the lateral supracondylate ridge, would be different if it was a mastodon. And since the project, we've had people get better and better at ancient DNA, and the DNA samples that were taken show that it is a Columbian mammoth, not a woolly mammoth, which before I started this project, I didn't even know there was such a thing. But anyway, different species of mammoths. So the find location was between Ellensburg and Yakima in a valley, which is correctly called the Weenas Valley. But where I grew up, that sounded rude. So I decided to start calling it the Weenas Creek site. So you couldn't tell I was mispronouncing the Weenas part because I said it fast. All right, so before we did anything, we knew it was potentially an interesting site just because of its location. So I put this red dot on this map. You see all the gray stuff there. So that is the area of Eastern Washington that was under the influence of the glacial Lake Missoula outburst floods. Are some of you familiar with the late Ice Age outburst floods? Some of you are nodding their heads and stuff like that, okay? So to simplify, we had during the ice ages, it wasn't consistently cold. There was warmer and drier times, and the ice would expand, those glaciers would expand during colder snaps. And one of those colder snaps sent a little lobe of ice across a river, and it basically dammed up the river. Giant lake piled up behind this ice dam, became glacial Lake Missoula, which if you've been to Missoula, Montana, and you look above town, you can see these horizontal lines that where the terraces, where the big lake carved out on the shoreline. So that lake got really big. We think that lake might have gotten the size of Lake Erie or so. Well, an ice dam isn't the most stable thing in the world. Eventually it's going to fail. And when it fails, all that water is going to come out fairly catastrophically. So it basically roared through Eastern Washington, carrying away lots of sediment, lots of previously buried mammoth bones, moved things all around. And so there's mammoth bones and little bits and pieces aren't uncommon in Eastern Washington in those flood deposits, but you usually can't say much because it's just a piece here or there that's in these flood deposits. This site was outside of those flood, and that's why the little red dot there. So we knew that there's a chance that we can get a more complete picture than you could in other places. So we did several seasons of field investigations. So this is some of the crews that I had. Gives you a little idea of some of the people involved. The first slide there is the geomorphologist and the archaeologist and paleontologist and stuff. And then each year students. You can also see some more of bronze artwork. The initial Mammoth Crossing sign, which was pretty great, but then Braun decided we need a human for scale. So the later ones have a little bit more elaborate Mammoth Crossing signs. So we did excavations for 6 years, and for 5 of those years, it was like the History Channel video that you just saw. But the 6th year, we tried to sort of clean up things a little bit. After 6 years, I had quite a bit of mammoth bones to try to figure out to say something about. And as an archaeologist, you usually think that it's important not to keep excavating if you've kind of gotten to the point where you really need to say something and analyze what you have. And leave stuff for the future when methods get better in the future. So we kind of wrapped up after 6 seasons, took the bulks out that were, some of those bulks had bones exposed for 6 years, tried to get it to a sort of more logical stopping place. So we had, it was open to the public. We had almost 9,000 visitors while we were open. It got a lot of local attention in the newspapers and TV, 40 times each or so. The History Channel video you just saw, and then public outreach things. One of which is an art student made us some really nice high quality casts of some of the bones. So on that left, bottom left there, I'm holding one of the bones I'll show you here in a minute. And it's quite impressive when you're showing it to kids that the bone is taller than the kid. Makes quite an impact on them. So it's great to have those to be able to bring around to public events. Okay, so a little bit of a summary of then what we found. So in this map, the dotted part across the middle, that's the road to Heather's house. And the gray squares are where we did a ground penetrating radar survey to see if we can figure out where the mammoth bones were. It wasn't successful. And then the blue areas are where we dug hand excavation units. And the tan, it was a backhoe trench. So the blue units, the black dot I have there, it says approximate location of original discovery. The original discovery was in February. We didn't start working until that following summer. And to keep the location sort of well preserved, it was covered up with dirt. So it wasn't super easy to figure out where things were. But as we found things, we kept expanding. So now I'm going to zoom in on that block of blue in the bottom left to see what it looks like in the main excavation block. So on this view, all of the things in black on the right hand side there are pieces of bone. And so you can see then I pointed out the scapula. That's the one that we were excavating in a History Channel video. The other humerus besides the one that was found by the backhoe, femur, some of the other, and there's a lot of rib pieces. The main thing you should notice there is it's not a nicely laid out, articulated, clean skeleton. It's kind of a confusing mess of stuff mixed up everywhere, which really is an accurate sort of view of things. So for the mammoth, we got, I don't know, what is that? Half the mammoth. I'm trying to show you schematically on the left. No head bits, no tusk, no teeth, but a fair amount of other long bones and ribs. And I'm trying to move along reasonably quickly so we get done in a reasonable time and you can ask questions at the end. But you can ask questions on anything later. Besides mammoth, there was also some bison. So for the bison, it's only the left rear leg and a little bit of the hips. So, you know, where's the rest of that bison anyway? Could lead to all kinds of jokes about the three-legged bison and whatnot. Anyway, it was mixed in with the mammoth bone. So on the map there, I circled in blue the bison bones that were mixed in with the mammoth. And sometimes people think it's strange to think about bison and mammoths, but what did they say mammoths eat mostly? Grass. And what do bison eat mostly? Grass. So it's really not too surprising that they die in the same kinds of places. And so it's pretty common actually that sites that have mammoth also have bison at them. So that's not a surprise. There was also what we call microfauna, so smaller animals like ground squirrels and things like that. I'll come back to thinking about them here in a few minutes. And then what about artifacts? First, I'll talk about age. I'll come back to artifacts. So how old is it? So we had bone, so we radiocarbon dated that bone, and that gives us an estimate of the age of death of animals. And those dates are 16 to 17,000 years old. But then we also used a method that archaeologists tend not to be as familiar with, where you date the dirt and you're essentially trying to get the last time that grain of dirt has seen the sunshine. So in this method, you take samples of dirt and you keep them not exposed to the sun, and you bring them to a lab and they shine a laser on them and they give you an age estimate. So those two yellow dots are where I drove a piece of PVC pipe into the dirt and sent it to a lab. And that top one was 12 to 16,000 years old since it's seen the sun. and the bottom one there was 15 to 21,000. So you can see it's a much cruder method than radiocarbon, but they both overlap at 16, 17,000. And I was trying to pick the difference between, can you see it's kind of smoother dirt on top and a little bit rockier dirt on the bottom. I was trying to get the very bottom of the smooth stuff and the very top of the rockier stuff, which if you trace it over is right where the bottom of that bone is on the right. So two different methods giving us about the same age. That's a good thing to be able to have that kind of information. That's called infrared stimulated luminescence dating, if you want a 25 center for today. So artifacts, the short answer is maybe. So this is our best argument. Where are that pink flag is in the wall there is where a really sharp-eyed student stopped digging as soon as she found an artifact, so we could have it in location. And what we have is what I have shown there in the bottom left. It's the same thing that in that History Channel video, I was silly, doing that, wiggling it around. Only I didn't realize, because I was not an editor, that I was wiggling around so you could only see the bottom, which tells you nothing at all of any use. And unlike the History Channel, the edges don't mean anything except it was broken. That doesn't help us. What really matters is the other side, the side I have shown here. Can you see how there are a bunch of parallel edges? So like the left-hand edge is parallel to a couple of things across the middle, which is parallel to the right edge. So that's important, because what it means is that when that rock came off of another rock, multiple times in a row, there was something at the same angle, which is harder to explain with a rock banging around, hitting another rock naturally, and makes much more sense if something directed things along that same path, like a human knocking off multiple flakes. So that's what makes it more arguable as an artifact. The other side doesn't actually help us much. So if that's an artifact, and we'll come back to that later, it's about 15 centimeters higher than the nearest mammoth bone. If it is associated, that would be a big deal, because even though maybe mammoth hunting isn't by itself that surprising, I've actually been told that on the Yakima Reservation and the Colville Reservation, they both have oral histories of mammoth hunting, which is pretty fascinating. But is this site an evidence like like from a crime show of this actually happening? And there's only a dozen or so sites where it seems really solid in North America. So if this one had a good connection, that would be important. And the other thing that would make it important is that the mammoth bones are pretty solidly 17,000 years old. So if this artifact is also 17,000 years old, as many of you know, that would also be a big deal, because although the story is sort of changing, it still seems like things more than 13, 14,000 are really controversial in North America. So potentially then it could be a very interesting site for those reasons. Okay, so that was a little bit about the field work. We've done a bunch of lab work. As many of you know, the field work maybe gets all the attention, but the lab work takes a long time. And we've been working on that for years, and we're not quite done actually, even though the field work was 2006 to 2010. So one thing we tried to do is figure out, well, can we figure out the age of that artifact? You can't date the rock, but can you date the dirt around it by that same method? And so I had the director of the luminescence dating lab come out and collect samples, and he dated 94 individual grains of dirt to try to see if we could get an age estimate for that artifact. And the answer is, well, 80% of those grains of dirt are about 17,000 years old, but 20% of them are about 5,000 years old. So what does that mean? Well, if you're playing the odds, you'd say, well, it's like an 80% chance it's a 17,000-year-old flake, which is really great. But if you're conservative, you'd say, well, maybe that flake just fell down a 5,000-year-old rodent burrow. And so that's how it got down there. And that's why you have the 5,000-year-old dirt. So if you like, you can like it either way you like. If you want it to be old or you don't want it to be old, you can use that evidence either way. Another thing we wanted to look at is it really an artifact? So is it an artifact or is it just something that's created in nature? You might call it geofact. And I told you earlier why I think it's an artifact, but it's more compelling when we compare it to all the other rocks there. So we did a study where we compared it to the other rocks, and really it's too different from the naturally occurring rock. So it's probably an artifact, but there's just not a lot there. So it's hard to be absolutely certain. The paleontology for the bison, there's not much of that bison, but it turns out that bison of that age are very rare in North America. So even though we don't have a lot of it, the paleontologists were very interested in that. But it doesn't have any signs that people had anything to do with it. It's not like cut marks or things like that on the bison bones. And then the microfauna, we looked at that because it might help you with the environment. You know, what different habitats little animals have might be able to help tell you what the environment was like around the site. And we identified some of those, but one of the problems, if you think about it, is what do ground squirrels and pocket gophers do for a living? Well, they dig holes. So how do we know that those pocket gophers and ground squirrels are even the same age as the mammoth, as opposed to digging down there from above? And the short answer is we don't know that. So it's hard to be sure what this means without some more study. Okay, then a few final things. We're finishing up the mammoth paleontology now. It was really hard for a while because I don't have a comparative mammoth skeleton in my lab. But now that things are available online more, the University of Michigan has a really nice 3D rotatable skeletons. So you could really tell a lot more, have good things to compare to figure out what the bones were. And I've also looked at all those bones to try to see, is there evidence that people were butchering or somehow other using these animals? And the short answer there is there's some damage, but it's probably not ancient. There's some damage from people for sure. There's some damage created by my students when they were digging the mammoth, but that's not really the human damage we're looking for, right? So, and then things like looking at the pollen. So I'm gonna switch now to, I'm gonna stop that share. I don't think I can highlight myself, can I? Oh, I can spotlight. Okay, I'm gonna make myself big here for a minute so that I can show you the Bonecasts. So we had an art student, Alfred Keller, that was really good at making casts, and he made these nice casts that we can use for public events. So this is a plastic cast of a human first neck vertebra. Okay. And here is the cast of the mammoth first neck vertebra. So you certainly get a sense of scale. And it's also interesting how similar it really is to ours. It's way more similar to ours than like a cow. And that's partly because a mammoth holds its head kind of on top of its vertebral column more like us than a cow. It's more straight out. But that maybe isn't as impressive to most people as the leg bone. So this is a cast of a bison left femur. It would go right there on me. See if I can back up so you can see me. All right. So now for comparison's sake, here is the mammoth left femur, which I'd pass around if we were in person. See if I can get far enough back. Uh-oh. There. So that gives you sort of a sense of scale. That is sitting on my knee cap right now. So obviously it's a little out of scale with me. Okay. I think at this point, it would be logical to go to questions. What happened to my view? Gallery, there we go. Okay. Anybody have any questions from that stuff?
Looks like we have a question here at OMSI for you.
Okay, shoot.
Yeah, does because the bones are scattered, does that indicate that animals were the carcass was on the ground, that the other animals like predators would tear up the carcass and scatter the bones around? Is that what's going on there?
That's a good question, and that's certainly a good hypothesis. That could be the case. So probably it's not quite like that though, because it looks like if you look at the bones, there's not much in the way of carnivore damage on them. So there's not like gnaw marks and stuff like that you'd kind of expect if that was the case. And I didn't really talk about the geology much, but the project geomorphologist is pretty convinced that the layer of dirt that all the mammoth bones and the bison bones are in is something that has come down the hillside in something like a mudslide. So the reason we got a confusing mess there is probably because the mammoth and the bison died somewhere up that hill and were buried. And then later there was a mudslide that brought the bones all down to their current location and made it kind of messy. So it's not a primary intact deposit in that sort of set. Okay, so I can see there's a chat question here. So what's left to analyze? It's a good question. So some things, we have some data, we just haven't written it up yet, like the pollen samples that we've had analyzed. The Mammoth Paleontology I'm mostly done with. I just need to find the time to kind of finish it off. And so the other things have largely been done. You could always do more, of course, no matter what you do. We've had some DNA done. DNA will continue to improve as a technique. So I sent some samples of the bison, for example, off to like the bison DNA person at the University of Pennsylvania. And she said, well, it doesn't look like there's enough sample. So maybe in a few years, as our methods get even better at pulling out more data from less sample, we'll have some more time. But we're kind of getting close to wrapping up the analysis stuff. Okay, we had another question on chat. Any plans to go back to the site and do more field work? It's a good question too. So from my point of view, for me personally, the answer is no. I did from 2006 to 2010 as a field work, and I'm just about to finish the lab work in 2022. So if that gives you sort of a sense of timing, that's a pretty significant time investment. And I'm not a paleontologist, so I don't really have a lot more to do on that end. There is more bone there for sure, but if you look at the map, it doesn't look like there's probably giant piles more. And there's probably not a lot more from an archaeology point of view for us to learn in the short term until we get a lot better methods. So it's probably better from that point of view to kind of wait until we get more sophisticated techniques. You know, in the future, it might be we do a lot different things than we do today. Before I go and answer any more questions, I should give Doug and Braun a chance to say something or ask something, or you want to contribute somehow? I see you're unmuted.
Well, yeah, we did form the Weenas Mammoth Foundation in 2013. And our main mission is to utilize the site for education, which Pat sort of talked a little bit about. But we, right now we're running an educational program for youth. We have summer camps up there where the kids actually learn the methods of being an archaeologist or a paleontologist and you know, a geologist, and you know, they're learning, you know, the history behind the mountain as far as the geology piece and techniques and we were, you know, we know that the kids are failing science, and we thought this is such a cool way to get them interested in local earth science, and the program's growing, and we're pretty excited about that. you know, big dreams is eventually getting a building up there that would house a museum and a lab and a repository and all that fun stuff. But of course, with that takes a lot of money, and we haven't quite got there yet. But, you know, we still are using the site for education. We hope we can continue to do so.
Well, and a little bit counter what Pat was saying, we'd like to, maybe somebody in the audience can help us, but we'd like to open the site back up every summer for a short while. We don't want to just go in there and finish everything. We want the community and anybody that wants to come up and observe the process of the excavation. And the site is, we're 6 miles out of a town. We're about a half a mile up a dirt, well, a quarter mile up a dirt road. I mean, how often can you go to a paleontology site that literally is right off a paved road? But that's where you said we had 8,000 people come. We had it open, what, 2 weekends and the weekend between. And we were getting, you know, that one Saturday, I think we had 900 people show up in one day. There's a huge interest, and we get calls, not every day, but at least 2 or 3 a week on, you know, can we come out and see it? What's going on? Is it open? There's a huge desire for people to come out and experience this. But because it is an archaeology site, there's a lot more rules than if it was just a paleontology site. And so that, in a way, hamstrings us from, you know, we have to have people with the right credentials. And by chance, if possible, if it happenstance, it was tied to human activity, you certainly want the right people in charge, the chain of custody, and all that stuff, because we're setting the clock back about 4,000 years from anything in this area of the Northwest. And so we want to make it visible to anybody that wants to watch it, but keep it accurate and keep it clean. And we're looking for a volunteer or somebody that's very reasonable to come up, you know, for a couple weeks in the summer or something. If anybody knows anybody. We're a real small nonprofit. Our whole annual budget's under $20,000 a year. We're already booked. We've already got 10 bookings between now and the end of May of activities that we're going to. So things are opening up, and you know, a lot of people are interested in this.
So you can tell from Doug and Braun's comments there that unlike some people when they retire who relax a lot, they thought, oh, let's turn this event that took place on our property into something that's we really try to give back to the community and do a lot of education. They've developed programming for K-12 schools. They've taken a trailer and outfitted it as a portable museum and driven it around to schools and county fairs and stuff like that. So it's really kind of amazing what they've done and how much dedication they have to the sort of educational piece of what can be learned from a site like this. And they're definitely to be commended. That's a very unusual thing that they're doing. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, we'll tell kids this animal probably ate grass out of your backyard, and they just, whoa. I mean, that, you know, you bring it right home. It's not like you're looking at a picture book or looking in a museum. This lived here. You know, it wasn't a flood mammoth. Neither one of these animals, they lived here. They ate grass here, and it really brings it, you know, it opens eyes and minds, not to everybody, but, you know, if we can just get a few now and then, that's a start.
And we also appreciate Pat for everything that he's done supporting our educational program through the years too. So, thank you.
And it does help to have Alfred having made those casts. Those are pretty nice.
Oh, yeah, Alfred.
Yes.
Yeah. And part of our at our camp that we're going to have 4 sessions signed up so far. We've got life-size casts, mammoth bones that we purchased from the mammoth site in South Dakota, and we bury them, and the kids learn how to archaeologically with the brushes in the air and a little bit at a time, bring the dirt down. And boy, when they find a bone, you can't drag them out of that big box. I mean, they'd stay there all night if we'd let them. And we got kids from 3rd grade through 12th grade. They all mix together. They all work together, and they're excited.
And we also have a teacher camp that we're trying to get more teachers to come out and learn how they can teach local, archaeology and paleontology and geology in the classroom. And they can earn their 15 STEM clock hours and they complete the two-day class. So that's getting to be real popular as well. So yeah, retirement's great.
Seriously, Brian probably spends about, I'd say, half time, 1,000 hours just working on curriculum and grant applications. There's not a lot of money out there, but we get nickels and dimes wherever we can. Yeah. Anyway.
But you can check us out, mammoth.org.
And come visit.
Thank you for your stewardship. And we did have another question in the audience.
Yeah. You mentioned that these bones, the mammoth carcass and the bison carcass got to the site by a landslide, and you saw this chert that might be maybe an artifact. Have you thought about tracing back that landslide to the origin of the landslide and looking around that area for the landslide to see if there's anything that might be of interest there, besides as artifacts or anything like that?
That's a good question too. So that was one of the things that the project geomorphologist was very interested in. So we made a series of small pits kind of up the slope from the site. It's kind of hard to tell from any of the stuff that I showed you, but where the site isn't super steep, but man, as you keep going up the hill behind it, it gets steeper and steeper and steeper. And it doesn't look like the kind of place, none of that hillside looks like the kind of place where you would have found anything in the first place. Because usually paleontology sites are where like things flow to, like low spots, not the sides of hills. So it's kind of a strange location in some ways. They never would have found it if it wasn't for Mr. Bacco there. But anyway, if you kind of trace it up the hill, it just gets steeper and steeper. And there wasn't like a obvious place where it could have come from. Maybe it's even farther away. Maybe it looks like it's probably an alluvial fan that it's on. So maybe as the head cut on the fan, it removed the location. Maybe it's farther up the hill. Anyway, there was not an obvious kind of place to find things, and it's kind of a needle in a haystack game. And we don't even know if that original location still exists on that hillside, but it's a good question. Lots of things still that are questions.
And the third wheel of what we look at is the geology. I don't know if you guys are familiar with all the lava flows. Well, you should be, but we're in the area where all the flood lavas, flood basalts back about 13 and 15 million years ago covered everything over here. None of the hills were here. And so the hills all around us are wrinkles, like a wrinkled rug, because of the rotation of the northwest part of the United States. Except our hill is a series of lahars and river gravel and topsoil. It's not basalt. And from what we can figure out from numerous sources is the lahars came down somewhere between 5 to 10 million years ago. Of course, there was more than one, there was many, because the hill right outside our house here is it's up to about 1,000 feet above from the valley floor to the top of the hill, mountain, I'll call it. And so the bones are laying right on top of some river gravel. It's not sharp rock, it's round rock that were part of these lahars from 4 to 10 million years ago. And so when these animals died, there maybe was, I don't know what, 6 to 8 inches maybe of mud there, of topsoil. And then in the last 17,000 years, about 3 to 4 feet blew in, because they're only about 3 to 4 feet below the ground, but they're laying on rocks that have been there for 4 million years. So it's you know, it's curious and interesting and things to talk about why wasn't there any topsoil there 17,000 years ago, and now there is. So it's a whole nother thing. And quite honestly, a lot of the student or the teachers, we open their eyes more to the geology, not to step on any of you guys' toes, but they're more interested in the rocks than they are the bones. But because it gives them an understanding of, they've been driving up and down the road, and Pat knows what I'm talking about. You know, there's a lot of interesting geology between here and where Pat is right now. And a lot of them had driven it 100 times and never really thought about it. And we open our eyes to some of the stuff that's happening. And it's you know, it's fun to share.
That's why Nick Zentner is so much more popular than I am, because he has Nick on the Rocks to fall back on in his large audience.
He is. He's very entertaining.
Well, if you would find a live mammoth and dissect it on the air.
Well, Nick doesn't actually know bones at all, and doesn't know paleontology either. Because one of the times it was filming, I know the film guy. He came back and brought me this thing. He says, "Pat, is this a mammoth bone?" I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "Because Nick said it was nothing." Nick said it was just a rock.
Well, we're probably losing our audience here, but anyway.
Other questions?
So there was one that was actually in the chat that I didn't want to glance over too quickly. Someone out, Terry Dolan asks, how remote is the area in terms of known habitation sites?
It's a good question too. And it's a little harder to answer than if it was on more public land. You know, if you're in a place where it's mostly private land, there hasn't been necessarily very much archaeology done. So we often don't know how many archaeological sites there are where there's lots of private land, because there was never something to cause Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act to kick in, and archaeologists to need to go check out in advance of a construction project or something. So when you're in places like where all the farms are near the Mayos Ranch, that we tend not to know a lot about the archaeological sites in terms of what's recorded. So there's not a lot recorded right around there, but I don't know that that really means there's not a lot there. It's just that nobody has officially recorded all those things.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Oh, we had another one come in. What
Oh,
was
hey,
the web address?
Doug or Braun, can you type into the chat or paste into the chat your
Well, if you just
foundation
go
account?
Weenas Mammoth, anyway, just a minute. It's a few miles to archaeology sites. At the mouth of the Weenas Creek is probably 3 miles, 4 miles. And then there was a wintering place up at some springs upstream, again, about 3 or 4 miles down in the bottom of the valley along the creek. I don't know for a fact, but I've heard that they've traced back around 8,000 years on some of those, at least down at the mouth.
Yeah, there's definitely some bigger later sites when you get down closer to the Yakima River. Virginia.
Yes, Virginia.
So, Doug and Braun, I just want to be the just give you a huge round of applause for all that you've done as landowners to steward your fine paleo archaeo site. And you really are a model for what we want landowners to do and be. And so just hands up to you from Portland for your contribution there, and for seeing the brilliance of Dr. Pat Lubinski and having him come up and work with you. But, you know, I was just thinking of different things that you were saying about, and Pat, you know, emphasized the public interest with 9,000 visits. It's just so extraordinary. And it just reminds me of something that I've thought about since I was you know, a teenager and interested in this kind of stuff, is this mismatch between the degree of interest in this. I mean, really, the interest is profound. it's just there. You don't have to work at getting people excited about mammoths or, archaeology more generally. But why we don't have the resources to feed that interest? I feel like we have to have bake sales to do this. So know that your sentiment, you are not alone in that. Many of us just wonder at the discrepancy and that interest and the lack of resources for it. So I don't have an answer for that, but you're not alone, okay? And just let's keep working that. But thank you so much for all you've done in support of this important record.
Well, you're quite welcome. But the STEM in the schools now, the STEM program or STEAM program, depending what has been I guess a catalyst to allow some money to come to us from different agencies, because we are STEM, and the schools out Washington wants kids to have outdoor activities. It falls right into, all of a sudden there's a box that we can check where there really wasn't boxes we could check. If you get around Portland, you get around Seattle, you get over to Spokane, there's some local money, but out here in the middle of the hinterlands, there's just very few, or at least until COVID. I mean, not that there was anything good about it, but in a way it did make some money available to help us get it out to the communities. But it needs to go away.
Agreed.
But anyway, thank you. And if you guys ever want to come up and volunteer during the kids camp, let us know.
Yeah, we've got no paid staff. Nobody makes a nickel out of any of this. And that's the way it is.
So we had another question in the audience today.
You made a reference that this is an archaeological site and not a paleontological site. Who made that decision? What criteria did they use, and who makes the rules on how the different sites are processed?
So I would answer that question that it's both a paleontological site and an archaeological site. So in some ways it's simple in that it's paleontological because it has ancient signs of life that may or may not have people involved with it at all, being the bison bones and the mammoth bones in particular. But maybe what you're referring to is kind of the rules around it. So if it was strictly paleontological and there weren't those flakes or likely flakes that show signs of human involvement, then it wouldn't have been registered as an archaeological site with the state of Washington's Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. And so then it wouldn't be covered under the state law. Washington is unusual in its archaeology protection laws in saying that archaeological sites are not to be, quote, knowingly disturbed on state land. That's pretty normal. Federal land, that's normal. And private land, which is very unusual. So in Washington state, you're not permitted to knowingly disturb archaeological sites, even if it's on private property. So since this is an archaeological site, that means that it has that protection under state law. So it's a little trickier to figure out how to hold a field program there than it would be if it was strictly paleontological without any signs of humans. Oh, really? Oregon has a private land too. See, I didn't even know. Thanks, Virginia. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that was just fine. All right. So last call for questions from anybody. Thank you very much for your time this evening and your lecture. This was great. Thank you for.
I'm happy to stay and answer questions even after all of you have left also, if you want, or most of you have left.
And thank you for kind of being with us through our first kind of hybrid adventure. So it's good to get half back out there. So, woo-hoo. All right, everybody. Have a good evening. Until next time. Oh, I'm sorry. I spoke too soon.
I have an announcement to make. Just before everybody leaves, when I made announcements earlier today, who knew what I was talking about? I talked about the Presidential Award, but I held up the Helen Hickson Award that Jim Kaiser announced last month for Katie Carmen. And she, come on up here. Let's go ahead, and if I have to be publicly embarrassed, so does she. So thank you so much for digitizing the basic training, getting that all up and ready to go. You've educated tons of people in OAS on how to become the next generation of archaeology stewards. So thank you so much. Yeah. And again, wanted to thank everybody for showing up both in person and is another question for Pat? What do you say? Okay, are you all right to take another question before we head out? All right, go ahead.
Was the bones preserved well enough that you could extract any DNA off of them?
That's a good question. So the bones were really pretty amazingly well preserved in the sense that a lot of times people are surprised. They said, oh, it's Mammoth Paleontology, but they're not rocks. They're not fossilized. And no, they're not. They are unaltered bone. This is the kind of thing that you have happen on this side of the mountains, but you wouldn't have happen on the other side of the mountains. You know, it's much drier here. The soils are slightly alkaline. That's much better for preservation of bone than on the west side where it's so wet and acidic that the bones aren't going to last very long. So the bones are in pretty good shape. They weren't in perfect shape. So when we were doing the excavation, as we found bone, we painted this stuff on that's called boot bar that helps hold it together so that it wouldn't kind of weather as we were exposing it to the air. It's the same stuff they use to hold safety glass together in auto windshields. So that's kind of a plasticky stuff. So all of the bones, if you see the bones, they're all a little bit glossy with this stuff that we painted on there to preserve them. But they're still in pretty good shape. Now, how good a shape are they for DNA? So even if bone's in pretty good shape and it looks good, that doesn't necessarily mean that the DNA is going to be in good shape. It's a little bit different story because it's more about the chemistry than the sort of the physical properties of the bone. The mammoth had really good DNA preservation in it though. So the sample I sent from the mammoth humerus to the guy who was doing his dissertation on mammoth genetics, we had an unusually good set of data for the mitochondrial DNA study he was doing. But on the other hand, the two samples I sent of the bison bones to the bison DNA person did not have enough DNA for her to figure out what species of bison it was. So it's a little more complicated than that. And we'll just have to see how methods improve to see if we can get, you know, DNA extractions that give us good results in the future. So it's kind of a yes, it's good, and no, it's not perfect, a little complicated answer, I guess.
Thank you very much. All right. So no more false call. Let's call it. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks for having me.